So next up is Phoebus Panigyrakis, who is an architecture graduate from the University of Patras in Greece, and will soon be entering the PhD program at TU Delft, the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands, in the Faculty of Architecture and the Built Environment there. His research interests lie with the concept of style in architectural theory, and he will be doing his doctoral work on the operative use of style in architecture design. His paper today is, as you see, on Greek polychromy and the total work of art. So, Phoebus, thank you.
Hello. Thank you for the invitation. It's a great honor. My speech is about Greek polychromy, but not exactly about ancient polychromy itself, but about its rediscovery in the 19th century and its effect in 19th century architecture. It is a part of an ongoing project expanding the theme of my research thesis on the idea of architectural style. An attempt will be made to contextualize the role of color in the theoretical arguments deployed to the architecture of the 19th century, acting as a catalyst for the rationalization of the discipline of architecture occurring at the time. Firstly, a brief introduction will be made on the emergence of polychromy in 19th century France, and then we will expand more thoroughly on Gottfried Semper, who was a German architect whose theories link polychromy with the concept of style. Thirdly, we will speak about the total work of art, which is coined by Richard Wagner, the musician, a friend of Semper, actually. So we will speak about it as an extension of Semper's theories on polychromy. And fourth, we will speak about the 20th century notion of total design as an evolution of the total work of art. In the 19th century, two debates marked the architectural scene. From the 1820s to the 1840s, the polychromy debate dealt with the rediscovery of antique Greek and Roman polychromy, and an effort was made to decipher what meaning and what did it meant, and how could they apply the same rules of color in their architecture. So key words here are Greek versus Roman idealism, the word enlightenment, the Grand Prix tours, which were travels made by the architects in the Orient, in Greece and Italy to find antiquities, and the polychrome contemporary architecture of the 19th century. Whereas the debate on style marked the second half of the 19th century, where architects needed to expand their profession, building libraries, museums, archives, villas, and chateaux for individuals, ceasing to be only in royal courts. And so institutions were made to train these architects in academies, polytechnic schools, and beaux-arts schools. So each institution needed to have its own specialization in its style. The main two styles were the neo-Gothic and the neoclassical. Well, we will be trying to make a liaison between these two debates with notions such as the covering of reality, the dressing, the exterior and interior form of the buildings, and the unification of the arts, in an effort to try to link the key words of color and form, the theme of this symposium, since polychrome is about color and style is actually about form. So our story begins in France in 19th century, where Quatremer de Quincy, a French art historian and architectural theorist, coined the term polychromy from the Greek words poly and chroma, which means multicolored. The French art historian came to be considered as the leading exponent of the Académie, transmitting in architecture the ideas of enlightenment. His own trips and excavations in situ as part of his grand tour, the classical pilgrimage undertaken in Italy for study and discovery purposes in 1776, provided the basis for a new method in historiography as well as artistic studies, where the analysis of source texts and archaeological research became the best, most modern method for reconsidering the ancient world. His eagerness of reconstructing images of antiquarian statues and buildings with reference to literary texts challenged the imagination of architects that drew inspiration from a historian's drawing in their studios. Quatremer had discovered traces of color in his own surveys, archaeological surveys, and he also was very interested in reading literary texts and trying to figure out how the statues were constructed. So, by he had already had a publication on the famous statue of the Olympian Zeus that was considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. In a revised publication of his work in 1825, he said that probably the huge statue was painted using the same colors as used on the building. And that was a revolutionary argument, since he considered the statue as part of the building itself. His ideas were contrary to the monochrome argument, since the Western civilization has based itself on the rediscovery on Greek and Roman art. The statues were thought to be in white, unadorned marble, simply because after so many years, the paint has worn out. But the white marble was linked with the pure material, and the Western civilization thought itself as an exemption of aesthetic values in not considering color as beautiful or as necessary. And it was more spiritual and moral superiority of the Western culture that could be shown in this kind of material. And beauty was linked with form rather than color that was linked with materiality. 18th century empires associated themselves with Rome, whereas 19th century republics associated themselves with Greece. And Quatremer de Quincy was in the revolutionary France. So what he said, since he was the most important man in the most famous institution of architecture, the Beaux-Arts, what he said had great effect on architects. Famous examples of monochrome and art and architecture as Antonio Canova's, for example, work, or Leo von Kleb's Valhalla, which is a copy of the Parthenon without color, as we still think about it, actually. The architect that is said to have single-handedly brought forward the reinvigoration of color in the modern world was the French-German architect Jacques Ignace Torf. Inspired by Quatremer's first displays of ancient polychromy while studying himself at the Académie of Beaux-Arts, he proposed the application of color inside and outside of buildings. But in support of this program, he undertook detailed and thorough investigations into the use of color in classical antiquity. For if he could show that the hallowed architecture of Greek architecture was colored, no other precedent for his present performance would be required, no further explanation needed. But for this to happen, the archaeological proof of traces of color would not suffice. He needed to show that a complete system of polychromy, manifesting that color could be used in context of a rational preposition for its application in modern architecture. As expected, he undertook archaeological surveys in Sicily in 1822, returning with colored drawings of temples, producing various publications dealing with detailed investigations and in each and every color adornment of the ancient buildings. His proof of color in Greek temples earned him publicity that later led to commissions, architectural commissions. For example, the monumental church, these are further details of his effort to figure out every detail colored. Well, he himself tried to reconstruct the image of polychrome architecture from taking examples for various temples, because he couldn't make out he couldn't find one temple fully colored, so he took examples for several other ones. And the result was quite, as you see, bizarre for the era. It's almost pop for our aesthetic. And he became notorious. One of his most famous commissions was the church Saint-Vincent de Paul, where he made a great effort to apply color. However, Ittorf was judged by art historians as not a rigorous thinker nor a talented designer. His archaeological studies were seen as naive, with facile arguments and comic extreme vividness in his drawings, while his architectural career did not see but a handful of commissions. But his famous fight to establish the importance of color in classical architecture is of the highest significance in the history of 19th century architecture, for he showed that the classical tradition could be reassessed in a fundamental and liberating way. And it was his very lack of success that inspired others to pursue more thoughtful and sensitive interpretations in their archaeological and architectural endeavors. So we go to our main person with the most important one here. Gottfried Semper came in Paris in 1826 after having been shortly educated in mathematics, history, engineering, but since he was not satisfied, he went in Paris to learn architecture. He managed to meet Ittorf through another German-born architect, Franz Christian Gau. Gau had made a name for himself by contributing to historical knowledge about the Egyptian and Roman antiquities during the earlier years, positioning his sentiment along Ittorf's, widening the debate on the use of color in contemporary architecture. Studying and working beside Gau and Ittorf for 3 years, the young Gottfried Semper inherited the passion of revisionism in these architects and longed for his own contribution to the polychrome debate on the side of the advocates of color. But was there new ground to be broken? Quatremer had already laid proof of the application of color in antique statuary art. Ittorf had already elaborated on the fact that antiquary architecture was also colorful, and more architects were presenting their own versions of complete system of polychromy, claiming to have been used in antiquity and should be artistically reinterpreting in the 19th century. Semper set for himself a much higher problematic. He attempted to exhibit that the application of color had specific meaning in each particular case, and commenced an over-ambitious project based on the assumption that the artistic and decorative elements of antique polychrome architecture corresponded to specific cultural, regional, and functional reasons and could be thus deciphered. It was this thought that will later lead him to a central figure of the debate on style that we will shortly address. Ittorf was also interested by the etymological explanation of the word decoration in Greek, where in Greek decoration is translated as diakosmos, and it literally means through cosmos. So it means that art should express the universal values for Semper. So this was his great trip in Greece, which was by the time in the midst of the Revolutionary War of Independence. So not a lot of architects or artists could go there, but he did manage, and he had various results. Wait a minute. In Athens, he produced detailed studies of the Parthenon, the Propylae, the Rechteum, the Tower of the Winds, the Monument of Lysicrates, and the Temple of Theseus. Aspiring to amass his founding in the most complete survey of Greek polychromy, he rushed back to Germany to prepare a publication. His concept of antiquity, claiming that buildings were entirely dressed in crimson red color, was bold even in light of the vociferous controversy still escalating in Paris. And Semper would focus the debate on the matter of colors of the most acknowledged buildings of classical Athens, the spiritual homeland of the Western culture that was entering a period of transition. Semper's 1834 publication, Preliminary Remarks on Polychrome Architecture and Sculpture in Antiquity, quickly put him in a conflict with the defenders of neoclassicist art historians. As he stated, he was found strategically outflanked by an academic coalition that wanted to bring the tedious debate on polychromy to a conclusion, less on the basis of received scientific evidence than with the presumption of judicious moderation. Semper himself did little to answer them, mainly because his publication has earned him his first European exposure, attracting both admirers and detractors. Shortly, the young architect that had until then no built project was offered a position in the Dresden Academy, where he would be responsible for monumental commissions. His theoretical work would continue no less than 17 years later as part of the debate on style. But it is no doubt that the key factors pointed in his work on Greek polychromy matured in this period of his practice. Some of the interesting facts that Semper deduced from his polychrome expedition and still continuing his architectural practice were the elaborative approach to a building's artistic details, such as sculpture, decoration, or painting on its walls in a quasi-theatrical composition in service of the communal ritual, but consciously choreographed, as he said. In addition to painting, and I quote, "we should not forget the metal ornaments, gilding, tapestry-like draperies, baldachins, curtains, and movable implements. From the beginning, the buildings were designed with all those things in mind, even for the surroundings, the crowds of people, the priests, and the processions. The monuments, the Greek monuments, were the scaffolding intended to bring together these elements in a common stage. The brilliance that fills the imagination when trying to visualize those times makes the imitations that people have since fancied and imposed on us seem pale and stiff." Secondly, the context. He supposed that environmental concerns could be linked with the choice of color. He said that the sunny climate and variegated landscape of the south made color a necessity, first to mitigate the glaring effects of sunlight, and second, to harmonize the building with its brilliant surroundings. It was in his polychrome treatise that he first stated his famous quote that art knows only one master, the need. The organic life of Greek art flourished only in the soil of need and the sun of freedom. He was also led to believe that color was a functional as well as artistic element, offering protection to the building materials from erosion of sun's light, as well as its glare from direct reflection on white marble. Thirdly, and this was the most interesting fact, he said that every architectural form could be traced back to its origin. As part of the symbolic polyphony, color stands not only in service to the particular symbolic form, but it also acquires formal or constructional value, such as visually distinguish the varying forms from one another. Semper came to an understanding of color decorations were part of an evolutionary process similar to the contemporary work of Darwin, for example, but now in art, that displayed them as traces of former structural and symbolic elements. The decorations were a trace of former structural elements. For example, decorative bands of color in buildings were a symbol of the structural act of binding. Colorful decorations of flowers were symbolizing former literal adornment of a building with flowers. Even moldings, bead fillets, egg and dart motifs, arabesques, rosettes, labyrinths, and running palmettes were symbols of former structural objects that were gradually incorporated into the building as decoration. It is clear that Semper's ambitious attempt to decipher every meaning that colored and sculpted adornments in buildings was proved to be a far more complex field of study than a mere archaeological excavation, interceding with issues of anthropology, structural engineering, as well as historic and artistic factors that could not be fully resolved. And now we can remind ourselves that Semper had already tried to learn several sciences, so he could not keep himself in one specific field. And after almost 20 years as an architect in Dresden, after having made a name for himself as a monumental builder, Semper was forced in exile after the political turmoil of the May Uprising in 1849 in Dresden, part of a revolution calling for a constitutional monarchy to rule a new united German nation. Semper fled to Paris in search of employment through his old acquaintances, but after that did not produce any results, he settled in London, where he was engaged in the works for the 1851 Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations. As a political refugee in London, he was not to be trusted with any major commission, so he turned again to theoretical works that could earn him a living. His most famous publications were the 1851 and 1852 Four Elements of Architecture and Science, Industry and Art, which are more like pamphlets, 50 pages or so, whereas he had already started writing his most famous book, There Still, Style in the Technical and Tectonic Arts or Practical Aesthetics. So style along with the preliminary remarks on polychrome architecture, are two central publications of both debates. Semper's contribution in these works was unprecedented in various ways. Firstly, his proposal of comparing architectural forms according to these elements in 1851 in his 4 Elements of Architecture, in a parallel way with his earlier propositions of the developments of color and the structural symbolism of polychrome decorations, he proposed that any architectural attribute originated actually from 4 primal elements that could lead us to an evolutionary understanding of the history of architectural forms. These primal elements were, or motives as he says them, were the mound, the hearth, the walling, and lastly the roof. As an example, Semper would posit the Greek architecture closer to the element of the roof due to the use of wood, and that was the primal cause of their tectonic aesthetic. Additionally, Roman vaulted architecture was considered closer to the primal motive of mound due to their constructional methods using bricks, allowing them to span wide distances. Semper's contribution was unprecedented in various ways. Firstly, his proposal of comparing architectural forms according to these elements distanced him once again from the classical understanding of architecture as an iconography of quasi-mythological symbolism. For while these elements were archetypical, they were treated with scientific prospect as cultural explanations of architectural symbolism. Secondly, the elements as a means to organize architectural form was a novel approach to the mere chronographic taxonomy of architectural history, allowing more freedom in the reconsideration of architectural form. And thirdly, and that is where we expand more, is Semper's astounding premise that the position that act of walling was related to the act of coloring or dressing with textiles parts of buildings. For Semper, textiles were considered the first technique that the human civilization has mastered in regard to binding, covering, and sewing and hemming. The knot for Semper was the first structural element, and if structure emanated from textiles, artistic motifs and decorative elements should also correspond to this element. Labyrinths, seams, bands of color, and frames should be considered as symbols of earlier structural elements of textiles. The use of fabrics for the act of covering one's body was seen as Semper as the archetypical birth of architecture. Through structures such as tents, textiles gave way gradually to the built form of walls, inheriting in them their visual appearance. This is why patterns that appeared firstly in carpets were later transmitted in decorations of walls as symbolic reminder that the first walls were actually fabrics. So what he is basically saying is that we adorn the capital, the junction, as a decorative element because we see in it the archetypical form of binding of with textiles, and the patterns of surfaces we see in walls are the primal motives are textiles. Semper's revelation that architectural decoration owed its power to symbolism of techniques was not enough, for if the architectural symbolism was there to remind us of a material's inner structure, then architecture was designated to an expression of construction distancing itself from any cultural or political aspect. Moreover, this idea that the exterior artistic form should express the inner core form had already been stated and was supported by architects that believed that the use of new materials of construction were the key factor for the reinvigoration of architecture and its engagement in new styles. Semper, wanting to distance himself from the materialists as well as the historicists, I'm sorry, don't mind that. Wanting to distance himself from the materialists as well as the historicists, stated that architecture's symbolic power lied in the covering of reality. His book, Style in the Technical and Tectonic Arts, elaborated closely on this concept. Textiles and the act of dressing, either in color or in architectural form, was considered the masking of construction. This meant that though the mastering of the structural symbolic appeal, the architect was responsible not for the expression of the true nature of materials, but instead for the organization of their theatricality. So, for Semper, the marble tectonic aesthetic of the Parthenon is the translation of the earlier tectonic construction of wooden temples. And it is of the same importance as dressing in color as dressing in style. So the marble is dressed as the style of wood, or colored wood. And he tried to understand the next question: why would the Greeks paint their buildings? For Semper, only the most sacred buildings were painted, and he coined a metaphor with the theater. He said that just like the actors dress themselves in masks and colored clothing in order to act as gods, in the same way the buildings should be dressed in color. I'm sorry. Yeah. So the basic idea was that architecture should emit a theatricality, a monumentality, in the same way that the piece of theater would. That's one of his buildings. He was famous for being in theater, so that was convenient. Another friend of him was Richard Wagner, the famous musician, who also had a revisionist approach to art, and he wanted to reinterpret theater, opera. He also had the same vision of Greek idealism as Semper, and he called his friend to build for him the most monumental theater the world has ever seen. So in Munich, Semper designed this building for Wagner, which would be twice as large as the Opera of Paris, for example. But we should skip this. So Semper brought with himself architecture and visual arts. He had thought about sculpture, painting, and architecture brought together in a single piece, whereas Wagner also had a multimedia approach in his work, where he wanted music, theater, drama, it all to be combined in a performance. So the total work of art for Richard Wagner was a synthesis of the art in a communal and collective way. Then the multimedia power of art should be used in a social context. And so little by little, the total work of art gave way to the notion of total design. A famous example would be Otto Wagner associated with total work of art, where we can see traces of this polychrome argument of Semper in this veiled decoration over the white stone. Actually, it's tiles, but the metaphor is clear. Another famous architect was Adolf Loos, where he used himself the notion of masking. He believed that the exterior should be white and neutral, whereas the interior should be decorated and rich. Another one, famous early modernist, was, and also all these examples of people were pupils of Semper. We have exact direct links with him. Yeah, you see here the textile use of brick. It is completely Semperian. In the 20th century, we have the total design of the Bauhaus, where instead of the approach in architecture, as Semper would say, as a homo universalis, where he would master all the arts and knowledge, Gropius thought of total design as a brought together of techniques. So architect was actually more like a manager in the industrial age than a choreographer, as Semper would say. So all these elements were designed as one. And that's my final slide. I'm sorry for the long talk. In conclusion, we as architects or general designers owe much to 19th century notion of the total work of art, because it is this concept that led to the legitimization of disciplines of design to infiltrate all kinds of production fields in the context of everyday life. And although color is a subject that has been systematically marginalized in academic studies, it was the study of polychromy in 19th century which preceded and shaped the concept of the total work of art. The the concepts triggered by the polychrome debate allowed architecture to break its ties with its neoclassical past, as we've seen with Hittorf, bring forth a freedom of stylistical dressing, as coined by SEMPER, and see that polychrome debate, the polychrome argument, lives on in the 20th century, where it led to the fantasy of design as control in modernism, and the designer as a conceptual artist that is a productive factor in our society. Thank you very much.